I really appreciate y'all having an interest in something that, more than interests me and it borders on obsession, but if you're gonna have one, this is a pretty good one to have. You learn all the time. Most of us grew up thinking we were smart until life taught us differently. And now we have a better perspective on the information that's given to us. What I'm going to try to do this evening is give you some information about a place that I think is extraordinarily undervalued. Beth mentioned that I had joined the Navy. I'll tell you how that happened. I had always wanted to go to sea. I don't know how or why, but even as a kid, I thought it was the best idea in the world. And when I turned 18, I went down to the federal courthouse in Campagna and enlisted. At supper a few nights later, I told my mom and daddy what I had done. And it turned out to be the kind of life-enriching, what's a good adjective? It was just one, it couldn't have been better. Have any of you been on Yorktown? Okay, all right. My ship is the Intrepid, which is the Yorktown sister ship. That's CV-10, mine's the CV-11. So when I stepped on board, I stepped back into World War II. It was just like that. And I got to sail around the world as a teenager still. You can't imagine how informative that is and how life-altering it is, because it gives you a perspective that growing up in a relatively small southern town doesn't allow for. So I did my time and got out. In the process, having circumnavigated and received the Order of Magellan, which was proudly hung. It was a great experience, and I never stopped loving the Navy. And then when my wife got the job on the base, I had a perfectly good excuse to spend an awful lot of time in the fleet bar. And there were a marvelous group of fellows. I never had to worry about her. She had a posse. If there was ever anybody who got out of line, they were asked to leave in the most unpolite way. It was a wonderful event, and I still hang out with those guys. As a matter of fact, last Saturday we had a reunion over at Bowen Island, and it was fellows we've been seeing each other for 40 years, and they're all good sailors. And there's something about sailors that's different. And I'm not just saying that there's actually a good story. If you want to look up something to read, just Google why sailors are different, and it'll give you a perspective. A lot of guys in the service go into a company that has a number, go into a battalion that has a number. When you go on board a ship, she's got a name. And when you go to sea, you're more than a crew, you're a family. You take care of each other, whether you like each other at the moment or not. Being a sailor is a unique experience. And this base contributed to Charleston for 100 years, the experience of thousands of sailors who had been around the world and who had been introduced to different societies and different food and different mores. They had a world perspective. And when they came back to Charleston, they wanted pizza like they had in Italy. Or they wanted Chinese like they had in Hong Kong. Or they wanted a good steak like they had in Rio. Those people came back with a different outlook on the world. And they went into town and they gave that acceptance of other people to our community. They also gave our community jobs. There were 25,000 people who worked on that base from time to time. It was the most incredible industrial operation you have ever seen. The shops were run by guys who had a high school education, but were repairing nuclear submarines. These were extraordinary people, and when the job had to be done, they stated that it was. And their families understood that. These were people with a work ethic. And I have to tell you that I really believe that the reason we have Boeing and the reason that we have Volvo and the reason we have other great companies like that is because Charlestonians are known for their work ethic. And that was gifted to them by the people who built this city. Charleston is a completely different town than it would have been had we not had that base. And what I'm going to try to do is make you evangelicals about these three historic districts. Which one of these buttons do I hit first? Top button? Okay. When you talk about, I don't have my notes on this, so I'm going to have to wing it. The 1700s were about rice and revolution. Come on. The 1800s were about cotton and rebellion. When the history of the 1900s is written, it's going to be called the Navy century, because there was nothing that influenced the city we live in now more than the Navy. It was the people who were civilians and worked here. It was the Navy guys who came here and stayed. It was the people who came from all over the country for special training who contributed to what is Charleston now. There's a reason why we're the #1 historic tourism destination. And it's because this city, for the last 100 years, has been influenced by the Navy and the people who worked on the yard. We ought not to disallow that history. We ought not to forget and let that part of our culture not be told. That's why I tagged it this way. Charleston was always a great harbor. There were ships that came here very early on, and there were shipbuilders who came with them. And those people settled here, and they started building small boats to sustain their family. They were fishermen. And as their skills blossomed, as a matter of fact, there were 17 shipyards in the Charleston Harbor. 17. These guys were trained. The guy asked me today, how did they get them to build that way? That's hard work. That's skilled craftsmanship. That's a work ethic. And as the technology changed in the maritime industry, it also changed the way we look at ships. We went from wood to steel. We went from wind to diesel and coal originally, and then nuclear. This was an evolution of industrial maritime. There's just not words for it. When they came this way, that's a whole different Navy. And this is what the base looked like. It was a beautiful operation. It was huge. As far as you could see up that river, that was Navy. But this is what came before. This is the Mississippian culture. I don't think you can tell the story of the place without talking about the people who were there first. And these were the original inhabitants. And this is probably the most emblematic marker that culture was there. These are mounds that were created as a part of the Mississippian culture. That you can't say tribe, that it was almost too broad to imagine. The culture that the Mississippians brought to the other tribes was really based right in the fork of the Mississippi. That's where the name came from, where the people came from. And they spread, and they were, what they had to say and offer was what people needed and wanted. And that's how that culture spread. Lord, we could use some of it now. And this is a series of mounds that I found an image of. You can look at those things and imagine the work that went into each one of them. The natives wove baskets of saplings and reeds and filled them up with dirt, carried them there, and piled one basket on and went back and got another one until they created these enormous structures. In Mexico and further south, they used stone because they had it. They didn't have it here, so they used what they had. The top of those were used for ceremonies. These are the tribes, and I think you know, see the names? Those are all still names that are familiar here, and that's why we can't talk about that place without talking about those people. I may be off topic a tad, but I've seen a archaeological dig that was done between Daniel and the Navy base that dated back to 2500 BC, and that wasn't the earliest one they're ever going to find. This is a topographical map. It's really hard to see here, but if you can see it up close, there are 4 mounds within that image. This is the land that the Navy base is built on. And those 4 mounds, have any of you been over to the base? Okay, no. If you look at the Admiral's house, it's sitting on a hill. If you look for H&I, it's sitting on a hill. If you look for, there are 4 mounds, well, there are 3 now, because one of them was bulldozed when they built the road back to Riverfront Park. There's no question about who was there. And this guy. You gotta wonder about him. In the notes I had written, what is this dandy dude got to do with the Navy or the Navy base or the Mississippians? This is King Charles II. And I think you all know the story. There was a civil war. He was able to regain his throne. And when he did, he began giving his favorites huge swaths of land, and they became the Lord Proprietors. And the Lord Proprietors were perfectly willing to let you have any land you wanted. There wasn't any in Britain. There wasn't anything left there to settle on. And people just wanted a place to go where they could have their own place. And they decided that this was a good place to come to. And the first one showed up in the 1670s. This is, how many of you heard of Ham Smith? Henry Arthur Middleton Smith. He was an attorney in one phase, but he was also a guy who was fanatical about tracing the land grants through to their owners. So if you ever go tracing a piece of plat and you're looking for something, look for Ham Smith first, and you'll find out everybody that owned that piece of land. I've got them all written down alphabetically, and I've got them written down chronologically. People don't value the history of North Charleston, so when I had a chance, I went back to that date and started pulling who these land grants were given to. And it's an incredible resource. You can find it online. And now this fellow. This is a guy by the name of Turnbull. He was the British Consul General, let's put it that way, to to the Ottoman Empire. And he was a favorite of the king, which came in handy because the king gave him 100,000 acres in Florida. That was his to settle. I'd take 100,000 acres in Florida. How about y'all? He was an interesting fellow. When the king gave him the land grants, he booked 1,400 indentured servants to work that land. They were indentured for 9 years. Within the first 2 years, half of them were dead. Okay, they had come from far off and settled into a mosquito-infested environment, and they were gone. And after that, the Spanish seized Florida, and he decided it was time to leave. And he got that land that's now the base. And he kept it, and he did well with it. And he eventually sold the land to Middleton. And Middleton and his wife lived there. This is to give you some idea that land is not without history. That land has a story to tell. That's why I'm so passionate about it. It cannot be underlooked. We can't let that happen. And so one of the laws I'm sucking wind is to preach this sermon. Henry and his wife, like everybody else, if you look up there in the upper right-hand corner for me, you see Retreat Plantation. Okay, that's the land we're talking about. That's the start of it. A little further south down there, you see Marshland Plantation. That's the other part of it. And you look right off the end of Marshland, there's a little scribble you can't read, and it says Dover Landing. And if you look on the other side where Daniel Island is, you find another landing, don't you? Okay. That's where the ferry came across. In about the 1900s, 1890s, 1900s, people in Charleston longed for the time, the 1700s, when it was rural. It was more almost. This was a place that they wanted to go back to. By then they thought this was crowded. And they decided, like a lot of other cities, that they needed an urban retreat to get away from all of this congestion. So they hired a fellow by the name of Frederick Olmsted. Ah, my man. Would that he had the tools to do it today. I'm a fan, I've got to tell you right now. And he was commissioned to create that getaway, Shakora Park. And this is a guy who created 570 acres or so. In that land, the trolleys ran out there, believe it or not. They had a dance pavilion. They had walking paths. They had a nursery. I've actually got a list of all the plants that were in Olmsted's nursery. This was an incredible opportunity to have what they have in other places now that are valued. In that place it wasn't. At that time it wasn't. But the land is still there. And if you look to the right, there's a little bump out in the water. That was a pier. And that pier wound up being the Admiral's Pier. And right behind it, that'll give you perspective. Straight in from there is what's now the officers' quarters historic district. And the streets that are in that district were laid out by Olmsted. He liked curvilinear streets to show off vignettes as you drove through. And those streets are still there. One of my I'm going to be polite about this. One of the things that I'm going to insist upon is that we retain those streets, because if you look at the National Park Service's, the Secretary of Interior's requirements, Now, this is a historic district. It has to be maintained in the place it was found, and the landscape is as important as the buildings. So if you run up on somebody who is trying to do something wrong, keep in mind that the landscape is as valued as the buildings that are on it. So my responsibility at this point is to keep that landscape in the form that we received it. Another lesson in life. This is what you find in Central Park, and Olmsted saw that. This is the National District, and he saw that this is landscape that enhances the built environment, as it should. And this is the place that I really like. This is the Columbian Exposition. This is the White City. This is where Olmsted created what you see there out of marshland. This was land that was really, it was hard, the people there thought it was hardly worth using. And he built this place that taught us what a city can look like and introduced us to electric light, thus the White City. By the way, it also introduced us to the world's first Ferris wheel. And then everything changed. Havana Harbor, the Maine, 264 men dead in one night. And if you go looking, you can actually find the written accounts of the commanding officers on board that night. It was published in a thing called Century Magazine. And it tells you what they actually saw, heard, and felt, and what their conclusions are. I won't spoil it for you, but look up the Century Magazine and look for the name. And this was the next morning. You see the flag? It didn't just happen to be there. It was reflown. And this is what led to war. Within days, our Navy was mobilized, and not long after that, the Asiatic Squadron under Fairmont took the Philippines. This is the USS Charleston C2. Guam surrendered without a shot. We were on the way to becoming a world power and having properties around the world that we were responsible for. And this came out of the Spanish-American War. It came out of that one night in Savannah Harbor. And the other thing that happened that wasn't expected. This is what ships would look like up until that time, until we suddenly had iron and steel. And this kind of ship was cumbersome and just wasn't a good way to get around, depending on the wind. And the Navy changed all that. This is what hulls look like now. This is steel. And that's going through the water at a disclosed speed of 40 knots, which is not to say it doesn't go faster. The ships that we're building now, the ships we're putting to sea, I got to be on the commissioning committee for the latest Charleston. I could not recognize the ship. I came from a W-2 ship to tomorrow's. What they've got out there afloat right now is just astonishing. And the reason that America is a world power is not just that we got land and war. It's that we have the greatest Navy in the world. When we need to extend power, we can do it with the Navy. I belong to a group called the Naval Guard of the United States. And our reason in life is to continue to inform people how important it is that we maintain the ability to project power and authority. We've got the world's largest carrier sitting off a coast where there's a conflict tonight. That's American power. We're not just a military power, we're a maritime power. The reason we've got harbors, we've got ships coming in here, the reason we've got jobs is because we do commercial as well. It's our maritime industry that makes the United States a world power. Now, I had an argument with them about them coming through my historic districts. Don't get me wrong. I'll give you one little story. I sat down with someone who was in a position to know, as they were considering building that railroad track through my historic hospital district. And they were going to take down some buildings. And I disapproved of that. And I explained very carefully how I felt about it. And the fellow sitting across from me said, "You're going to lose." And I said, "Yeah, but you're going to know you've been in a fight." And they wound up having to do some mitigation money. And we're using that money right now to restore buildings on that base. And I ain't done with it yet. Now, if you can see the date on that, it says 1861. This is an old map of the Charleston Harbor. When the Yankees, and this is my southern speaking, y'all got to understand that. When the Yankees couldn't take Charleston, they moved on down the coast to Port Royal and set up shop down there. One of the nice things about Charleston Harbor is it's extremely defendable, as those Yankees found out. This is a real harbor. And we were going to build a Navy base here. Well, it was a political decision. As always, there was a lot of giving in. There was some unkind language between people who were in public positions. And they decided, well, we're going to build it in Charleston because of Charleston crowding one out. Well, you can convince the Navy to do the right thing, but then you've got to talk to the local folks. And this is one of our locals. This is Cecilia Baldwin. And I love Cecilia. She's got a face only a mama could love. A little more southernism for you. Cecilia and her husband had a big dairy farm over on James Island. And every morning, Cecilia brought over by boat battery milk. And that's what woke up the folks in Charleston. That was their milk source. It was Cecilia. And she was, I'm having to be polite, y'all. Cecilia was cantankerous, okay? And you had to win over the locals, but the guy that they picked to do it was this lovely fellow, Edwin Longnecker. That's his real name. And Edwin graduated from the Naval Academy in 1861. And he spent 40 years sailing around the world. And he took on all kinds of, the reason it says the USS Mississippi behind him is because during the war, he was in the battle on the Mississippi. This guy was hardcore Navy. But he had one more battle he had to fight. Edwin had been selected to be the first commanding officer of the Charleston Naval Shipyard. And one of the problems was that Cecilia had a piece of land that they needed real bad. And he had to convince her. One hot August afternoon, all the groups got together, and Edwin came back to town. He'd gone back up to Washington. And he came back to town and spent the night. And he and the government paymaster took a trolley out to what had been Socorro Park and what was about to become the Navy base. And I don't have my numbers numbers, and I apologize for that. But it works like this. The city of Charleston had owned that land because they developed Shakur Park. And they got a check for about $32,000. And then the city of Charleston sold the Navy hundreds of acres down where Marshland Plantation was for $1. And then it was Cecilia's turn. Her representative, she didn't even bother to show up, accepted a check for $50,000. It was all about the money. And if you don't have a shipyard, you've got to have a dry dock. Now imagine trying to build this on the edge of a tidal river with 1900s technology, and then you had to line it with concrete, and then you had to put big iron doors on it, and then you had to build a system of pumps and piping that would either flood it or suck it dry. And that's what they did. This is the dry dock 1. If you've ever been on the Navy base, when you drove right up to the stop sign and looked right over there, 125 years later, that dry dock's still there, and it still works. Didn't operate it. And those pumps take a lot of power. And I don't know if you've seen this building or not. If you've been on the base, you can't miss it. I love it to death. I'll tell you about it in just a minute. But this was the powerhouse. It's at the time there was a movement called the City Beautiful movement, which said that just because something is utilitarian doesn't mean it has to be ugly. And so they decided to build a beautiful building. It's in the Beaux-Arts. Let me go back if I can. No, I'll skip this file. The building is built in the Beaux-Arts style. And the only other major building like that in Charleston is the DIHS. So if you ever want to see another example of Beaux-Arts, those are the two places I know you can go. Now inside the powerhouse, from the dirt to the ceiling, is 60 feet. Inside that building, it's a 6-story building. Okay, it's enormous. And every pipe you see on that shot was under extraordinary pressure. I mean, they were in the business of generating electricity. They had to have boilers. The boilers originally used coal to generate steam, to turn turbines, to power everything from the street lights on that base to the pumps on Dry Dock 1. Everything they did came through and depended on this powerhouse. It was an incredible work. It was a jigsaw puzzle, and it was manned by men working in an environment. Think about how hot it is in there with those boilers in August. And the work conditions they had to work under. Every dial, every gauge, every weld, everything in there had to be absolutely perfect. And I'm emphasizing this because that was the standard of that shipyard. You didn't do things halfway. Okay? If you did it, you better do it right. Because if that thing lit off, it was going to kill everybody in there and put that entire operation out of business. They took this seriously. And that was the work ethic of that shipyard, of those thousands of people who went in there every day and worked in these conditions. Now, if you look at the background on this, you can see brick structures. Those were shops that were built for every skill that was necessary. It didn't matter what you needed, there was a shop that built it. You might do well to understand that every ship you've seen is a machine. Every ship, everything there is a machine. Everything that makes it go, makes it float, is a machine. this was one of the earliest. But if you look, and you can't really see it now, but behind her, there was a shipyard of dry dock, but they were also still using wooden ways. And they would grease the ways and slide them into the water. And this was the SS Wave. It was a ferry. They were making yard craft like this tug. And this is the Asheville, 141 feet, about 41 feet at the beam, drew about 11 feet of water. So it wasn't just small craft. They put out some mighty big ships. And what I'll probably have to do, I had to limit myself as how much we could sit through. And I stopped early because there are a lot more stories to tell, but this ship was lost to the Japanese during World War II. And I'll tell you that story in another show later on. But at the same time, all this shipbuilding was going on. This is something people just don't know about the Navy base. This is lost to history. This is Camp Bailey. There were 5,000 Navy recruits sleeping in pup tents under the pines in January and December and February. This was a training camp that was on that base property at the same time the shipyard got cranked up. And this is something that people in Charleston had just no knowledge at all about. That's why it's my job to find this history and keep it going. This is the small craft that he was, the namesake Bagley, was killed during the Spanish-American War and received the Medal of Honor. That honor was passed on to those recruits by the name of that base. Eventually they moved the guys into barracks, and they had, as you can tell, all the comforts of home, except your mama wasn't there to do your clothes. If you look to the right on that screen, you see those look like material folded over? Those were actually mattresses. Yeah, and you had to carry them with it when you got changed to duty station. You took your mattress with you. They had days called air bedding, and you would take them out there and air them out. It was fragrant. Now this is the mess hall, and if you see that little group of fellows standing there in the front, those were the base cooks. And if you see the guys standing in the background, that's why the Navy invented mess cooks. They had to do the work. This is the inside of the mess hall. Now think about, what would it be like if you had to feed 5,000 hungry teenage recruits 3 meals a day? This will give you some example. This is outside, but this is Thanksgiving 1918. And then they had to do the dishes. This was the YMCA hut. This place was self-contained. And this was the American Library Association had a library on the base. And a good boxing match every now and then would let off a little bit of steam. I know you can't see it, but in the pine trees around there, the guys who climbed the trees so they could get a better look. Now those guys laying down on the mat, I don't know what happened. Maybe they were the earlier victims, I'm not sure. And this is, I put this one in there for a reason. One of the things that the Navy does, speaking from first-hand experience, they take people from absolutely every walk of life. They take guys from the country and city slickers and put them in uniform and put them in line and teach them how to be nice to each other, to work together, to get the job done, and to obey. Those guys didn't grow up learning how to march and stand in formation. They've been taught. It's the most incredible brainwashing operation you've ever been a part of. One of the things that the Spanish-American War had taught people was that those big machines needed a lot of help. keeping them running, keeping them operating. So there was a machinist mate school open on the base. This is the class of 1913. And this is the class of 1918. Okay, that's what World War I taught the Navy, was how important machinist mates are. There's one guy you don't want to make mad because he won't never fix nothing in your division. Okay? Machinist mates are people you love. But that shot was taken in front of the powerhouse. You can see OSHA wouldn't let him take that picture today. And this is one of the most famous ships in the United States naval history. And that's a piece of it. So when we get through, y'all come up here. This is a piece of the mast for the USS Hartford. Okay? That was the receiving ship here. When people came on board, they went to the receiving ship and received their orders. Where you going to sleep, where you going to eat, who you going to work for, everything you did, you got told right then, right there, and they let you walk down and go to it. They didn't want to have to look at you again. Okay? So everybody that came on board that base came on board the Hartford. And I think you may remember damn the torpedoes full speed ahead. That's the Hartford. This is the ship. And she was here in Charleston. Okay? That's maritime. I got emotional, sorry. One of the guys that walked on board was this skinny little fellow who claimed to be a reasonably good artist. Okay. Everybody knows him. Hello, woman. Rockefeller was assigned the duty of drawing illustrations for the base newspaper called The Float and the Shore. And that was his job. They put him to work doing what he knew how to do and what he was best at. It made all the sense in the world. And one day, a fellow walked in, dressed in all white, covered in gold braid, wearing white gloves, and leaned over to look at what Rockefeller was working on. It was this guy, Mark St. Clair Ellis. You gotta love a name like that. The Admiral, Commodore at that time, put his hand down on the pallet. And Rockwell saw it and thought, oh Lord, I'm going to Siberia. My days are over. They're going to put me digging ditches or something. It was going to be horrible. He was sitting there trembling. Claire Ellis reached down, peeled off his white glove, and gave it as a gift to Norman Rockwell. This portrait was painted by Rockwell on behalf of, well, it was his way of getting in good with the boss. It worked out pretty well. I tracked that, you see the crackling in it. I tracked that picture down to a lady in Arkansas, and then she died on me. And I had to go find her niece, his great niece. That picture has been perfectly restored, that portrait, and is in the house over on Johns Island right now. I'm hoping someday when the day comes, I know it's going to stay in the family, but we can hope. I would love to have that in our collection. And as it happened, Rockwell was still under contract to the Post when he joined, well, when he got drafted. And he could continue to draw covers they allowed him to, as long as they were nautical in theme. And this cover was called Dreaming of His Girlfriend. And the guy smoking the pipe is the old Salt. And the young guy, the dreamer. And I couldn't leave it alone. I had to find those fellows. And it turns out, I came across an article in the Augusta paper, and the guy with the pipe was from Augusta, And the guy dreaming of his girlfriend was from Edgefield County. This is USS Houston. And this is the US Houston. This is a step forward in time. This is when World War I came upon us. That first ship you saw was a German collier. And there were a number of German ships in the harbor when the announcement was made that we were at war. And all the captains had standing orders that when this announcement comes, you're to sink your ship. Every captain on the ship in that harbor, German captain, was under orders to sink his own ship. Sacrilege. Well, those machinist mates I showed you, they were able to refloat that ship, put her back in shape, and commission her as the USS Houston. Kind of a taste of justice, ain't it? W1 was really where that earlier picture you saw of the submarine really had taken hold by that point. And some operations were big. They were even, as you can tell here, done in our dry dock. We had a good subfleet in W1. This is a German boat that sank 260 something ships during World War I. It was the largest kill rate for any southern service. That was a British cargo ship that they took down. When the war was finally over and the boys came home, it was kind of a mixed blessing. They were safe, they were back, they were home. But the shipyard was in trouble. There wasn't the need for all the production work that they had been doing. There were a lot of guys who moved here, their whole families. People came from all over to work in the shipyard. I mean, there were people who drove from Orangeburg every day, and Georgetown every day, just to keep their job at that shipyard. The pay rate was something like 60% the state average above. It was an incredible job. You got what you kept it. And they were about to lose their jobs. And it happened. There you go. And that's when the WPA came to town. As it happened, Roosevelt had made several trips here. He was fond of Charleston. He also had a good buddy named Bernard DeRoot who lived right up the coast. And it was kind of his reason to come visit Bernard. But he would come to Charleston, and he took an interest in the base. And when things got tough, he put a lot of WP money into restoring and updating the port. They put in new pilings along the waterway to harden the coastal approach. They put in concrete pilings so that they could pour hard concrete later and put in real good piers. The Marine Barracks even got a little taste of it. The Marine Barracks, that big building on the right, was one of the first buildings built here. And it got a lot of water damage. There was a roof leak. And we're using some of the mitigation money that we got from the Port Authority to stop that problem and to restore that building. I'm not sure yet. I don't think there's a final decision on what the purpose and use for that building is going to be. I have a pretty good feeling that it's probably going to be office space for people who need prestigious address. We've got the leaks pretty much stopped. There's a lot of restoration because it went all the way down to the floor. So there's a lot of work to be done in that building. But we got the money. And this is to me, to my mind, this is the most important thing that the WPA did in Charleston Naval Base. I've got pictures, the WPA documented everything. You couldn't look away but what they were taking a picture. That building was on plain dirt. And it's poured Portland cement. Okay? I have pictures of that place when it was dirt and pine trees, and pictures of guys wheeling wheelbarrows up and pouring it into the form. That whole building is solid as a rock. The building's going to be restored. It's already some work being done. We've taken all the tile that was on there. That tile's been taken off and has been stored. It's going to be reinstalled. We're going to keep that building the way it is. The use of that building, it's probable that it's going to be some sort of housing operation. We don't quite know yet, but it's built for it. And it has the room for the infrastructure that it would take to keep a building like that functional. Underneath the ground, there was a great laundromat, there was a great kitchen. I mean, this was an incredibly well thought out, beautifully executed building that is going to be put to another good use. And the shops started being built, and this is when the base started looking like we look at it now. And then this happened. Okay, so we're back to where we were with the main. And we're back at it. And the enlistment posters went up. Everybody wanted you in the service. But there was a need for yard workers as well. This was right after Pearl Harbor. Those posters went up and people started coming in, coming back to work. And this is what Labor Day 1942 looked like. Is that stepping up? That's what it looked like. That's the people that were the yard birds. Because that's what everybody called them. It didn't matter what fort you went into, they were yard birds. And they wore it nicely, most of the time. But these were people who committed their life and their career to the Navy. They just didn't have on the uniform. They made good money, they worked real hard. When the job said you've got to be done by this date, they did it. If they said you've got to be done for this much money, that's what they built. It was his own time. The Charleston Navy base, just before it was closed, was selected as the best shipyard in the Navy. This was a first-class operation. Come on, give me that. And as soon as war was declared, they started laying keels. This keel was, the admiral at the time was actually from Florence County. Nice guy. They were commissioning ships, one right after another. The way they went into production was phenomenal. I like that picture because she's got her eyes closed and she's getting wet. And this ship headed to serve her country. You know the old two-lane Cooper River Bridge up there? And this is my favorite ship. Well, I hate to say that, but it's one of my favorites. This is the Grayson. She was laid down and built here in Charleston. Grayson was given credit for firing the first shot in the liberation of the Philippines. Back up. Oh, I can't back up. The reason I like her so much, her fellows received the accolade. They say 93 fellows whose ship had been shot out from under them. They were called the Angels in White Hats. They got 13 battle stars and never lost a man. The flag that was on that ship hangs on the wall beside my desk. Okay?
Where's it at?
On the wall beside my desk in City Hall. It came to me in a little box about this big. I got all the stuff that came off the Yorktown Museum, and it was in a little box about like this, about that big, and just stuck in there with a note. I took it to a lady who knows what to do or something like that. She ran the frame shop up in Fort Jackson. She did the work for the South Carolina Military Museum. She had done the work with Yorktown. And I met her up in Orangeburg, about halfway, and I said, "What can you do with this?" She said, "I'll take care of it." I said, "Okay, I'm gonna trust you. All I ask of you is I don't want it clean, and I want it to look like it's flying." And when she brought it back, she called me one day and said, "I got it done. I'll meet you in Orangeburg." I drove up there to meet her, and she opened the back hatch, and it was laying there. I got chills, y'all. It was absolutely beautiful. And I asked her, I said, "How did you decide how to display this?" She said, "I didn't. The flag told me." And if you look at that flag, you can see the fine threads. The end of the flag is called the fly. And that's the part that tatters first. And it tattered up into a piece about this big. And she framed it like it was still flying. That's one of the reasons why I'm off topic again. We've got to have a museum that tells a story. We really do. This is too much history, too much give by too many people not to honor them that way. Oh, back on Campagna. That ship you were looking at. I know 5 minutes, I got you. This is the hospital that we were looking at earlier. The ship you were looking at earlier, there were ships that came in here that didn't have guns. They were hospital ships. And this is a part of Charleston history that almost nobody knows. During World War II, there were 23 Army-operated hospital ships here in Charleston Harbor. When somebody was wounded in the European theater and they couldn't be treated there, they were put on board a ship, brought to Charleston, and treated here. Most of them went to Stark Army General Hospital first. The ones that needed immediate attention were taken to that hospital. There were 75,000 Purple Heart recipients that came home to Charleston. That don't get to your heart, so you ain't got one. This is an aerial view of the hospital. It was enormous. It was a lot bigger than it is now. It was state of the art. They had wings that were dedicated to a particular problem. If you had an amputation, you went in one ward. This was ahead of its time. This is what it looked like on the inside. Beautiful. And this is the bed that was going to be needed real soon in ways you can't imagine. This is an injured American being put on a hospital ship. Those ships were run, they were painted white. They had a big green stripe down the side of them. They had hearts, and they ran with their lights at night. So they'd never be thought to be anything other than non-combatant. This was the route they took. They came from the South Atlantic to avoid U-boats. This is the Blanche Sigmund. This is one of the ships that brought the wounded back. And this is Blanche. And the reason that ship was named for her, she was the lead nurse on the landings at Anzio. And she was killed tending the wounded. 75,000 Purple Hearts. And that's why it's going to be the Navy century. Now, I'm going to ask one thing now. You all have your hands full with Daniel Island. I got that. If you ever have an opportunity to put in a vote for the 3 national historic districts that are on that base, if somebody asks you, raise your hand and say, yeah, it needs to be done. Okay? That work's being done by Jamestown Development, as you may or may not know. It's run by William Cogswell, and William and I have a very good understanding. If I don't like something, I'll express my opinion clearly. And he's got the money, so he writes the check. But I think what we're going to come away with is a collection that tells a story that will draw people to Charleston, that will give them a different experience. We've done Fort Sumter, we've done Fort Moultrie. What can we do now? We can take them and show them where history was made and where the Charleston we know now, the Navy town, came from. Okay? And I'm supposed to have time, but I'll probably run over. Yeah, before she comes and gets me and drags me off the stage. When we get through, if y'all have time, this is a piece of the Hartford. This is a map of Chicora Park. There's a shape of the Hartford. I'll tell you, I got that piece of the Hartford. A friend of mine went to the Washington Naval Yard to restore the run. And in order to reward him, they gave him a piece of the mast, and he gave it to me. So if you find somebody that's got good stuff from the Navy base, give me a minute.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. There's a lot of people, I guess, in the past, but they did.